Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Hey gang, before we get started, I apologize if my voice is a little soft and quiet on this episode. We've got a couple of new kittens, and they're in my regular studio area, and they're driving me nuts, so I had to move to a different place in the house, and everybody's actually trying to sleep at this point of the night. So, my apologies. I hope it doesn't ruin anyone's experience. And if you're in the U.S. and celebrating, have a happy and safe 4th of July. Creepy camping trip on the 4th of July. Submitted by Jill. I was 27 years old when this happened, the 4th of July weekend 2012. 3 of my closest friends and I planned what was supposed to be a relaxing girls-only camping trip. We've been looking forward to it for a couple of months. We just wanted some campfires, hiking trails, cheap food cooked over a grate, and a weekend away from work and our phones and our guys. Yeah, sometimes the girls like to bust out on their own too. But instead of all that, we spent 2 nights wondering if we were going to make it home. We picked a campground a couple of hours from our town. No one had ever been there before, but we heard it had a reputation for being quiet and heavily wooded. We arrived late Friday afternoon, set up some tents, and then laughed about how none of us actually knew what we were doing. I mean, we burned the first batch of hot dogs, that's how inept we were. That was after a mighty struggle to just get a fire going, and we were joking that we'd survive the weekend on marshmallows if we had to. Even with the setbacks, everything was going well. The campground was busy because of the holiday, and we saw lots of families riding bicycles around the loops, and kids chasing each other with glow sticks, and fireworks were echoing from nearby towns after sunset. By 10 o'clock, though, the campground began settling down. Fires burned lower, and conversations were fading, and the woods became almost unnaturally quiet between distant explosions of fireworks. That's when I noticed this really creepy guy. He didn't look like a camper, and he wasn't carrying any fishing gear, and he wasn't walking a dog, all the normal things you see in a campground. He was just simply wandering down the middle of the campground road with his hands shoved into the pocket of a dark sweatshirt, despite it being hotter than hell in July. He moved really slowly and just was staring at every campsite that he passed. When he reached ours, he stopped. All of us looked at him, but we didn't say anything. He just kind of gave us this weird grin and said, "You girls out here by yourselves?" The question immediately made every one of us uncomfortable. One of my friends answered that our husbands would be arriving in the morning. That was a lie. He looked past us toward the tents before saying, looks like you've got room for company." I guess it was a joke, but none of us laughed. After a couple of more awkward seconds, he just wandered away into the darkness, and we all agreed he was just some creep. At least that's what we wanted to believe. We did our best to forget about him, and we spent the next day hiking and swimming and watching families prepare for the evening festivities. Every now and then, one of us would glance around and ask if anyone had seen that weirdo. Late that afternoon, I finally did. Only this time, he wasn't by himself. 3 men stood together near the campground entrance watching people drive in, and when they noticed me looking, they stopped talking. One of them pointed in my direction. I happened to be walking by, and they didn't follow me, but they didn't have to. Just knowing that they'd noticed me was enough to make me feel weird. There was a large celebration going on down at the beach with a lot of families, but we all decided to stay close to our campsite instead of going down there. Around dusk, the same 3 men walked slowly past us again. One whistled while another said, "Looks like the husbands never showed up, huh?" They had remembered exactly what we had told that guy the night before. But they kept walking, only to return an hour later. Then they passed us again. Each trip seemed slower than the last, and every time they looked a little more comfortable lingering near our campsite. When it was completely dark over the campground, we locked everything valuable inside our vehicles, charged our phones, and spoke with the campground host about the men. He frowned and simply told us that he'd keep an eye out for them. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was all we got. Around 11, we climbed into our tents, but sleep didn't come. Every little sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and branches snapped somewhere beyond the campsite, and leaves were rustling in the breeze. Someone laughed faintly in the distance, and I remember being angry about that, silently telling them to shut up. But then came the footsteps. They weren't on the campground road. They were inside our campsite. The footsteps moved slowly around the picnic table before stopping beside one tent and then continuing toward another. None of us girls spoke. I know we were all awake. And then something scraped across the tabletop, and someone whispered, "You awake?" Another voice answered with a quiet laugh. The footsteps continued circling the tents before finally fading back into the woods, and none of us moved for nearly an hour. When sunrise finally arrived, we all kind of got out of our tents at the same time. Our picnic table had been rearranged, and our folding chairs now sat in a perfect circle facing the tents. Someone had stacked firewood into a strange little tower or something in the center of all this. Nothing had been taken. Whoever had entered our campsite simply wanted us to know that they'd been there while we slept. We looked at our gear and debated leaving immediately, but checkout wasn't until the following day. And eventually, after talking about it for an hour, we convinced ourselves that it had probably been some teenagers just trying to scare us. Looking back now, that's a decision that I think we all regret more than anything else we did. Saturday night was even worse. Shortly after dark, we heard voices again. This time they didn't bother hiding. They laughed somewhere beyond the trees while flashlights occasionally flickered between the trunks before disappearing again. Once, I clearly heard someone imitate an owl, and seconds later, another owl call answered from farther away. This didn't sound like campers having fun or playing pranks. It sounded like people trying to communicate with each other. We all walked together to the campground office, only to find it empty. Apparently, the host had gone home for the evening. As we returned to our campsite, one of us noticed the cooler sitting several feet away from where we had left it. None of us had moved it. A little after midnight, we finally heard approaching vehicles. Relief washed over us when 2 sheriff's deputies slowly drove through the campground, and another camper reported suspicious people wandering among the campsites. The deputies stopped to speak with us, too, and they listened carefully as we described everything that had happened over the past 2 days. While we were talking, one deputy suddenly turned and shined his flashlight deep into the woods behind our tents. 3 men stood perfectly still between the trees. They hadn't made a sound. They weren't talking. They were just standing there watching all of this. But the instant the beam illuminated them, they turned and disappeared into the dark. The deputies obviously ran right after them, and for several minutes all we heard were crashing branches and officers shouting commands before silence finally settled over the woods. Eventually, the deputies returned, frustrated and out of breath. Despite searching for nearly an hour, they hadn't found one of those guys. They encouraged us to leave as soon as the sun came up, and none of us argued about that. We packed up our campsite in record time the following morning, and as I loaded the last cooler into my car, I noticed something tucked beneath one of the windshield wipers. It wasn't a note. It was a single 4th of July sparkler, bent into the shape of what I thought looked like a crude smile. I looked around the tree line, and nothing moved and no one was standing there, at least not that I could see. Years later, one of my friends admitted that she'd seen something she never told the rest of us. During those footsteps that were walking around our tents on that first night, she'd quietly unzipped one corner of her tent door just enough to peek outside. She counted 3 men standing in complete silence around our campsite. They weren't talking to each other, and they weren't going through our stuff. They were simply watching our tents, waiting to see if anyone would come outside. I've been camping plenty since, but never without a lot of neighboring campers nearby, and never without paying close attention to anyone who seems more interested in watching other people than enjoying the outdoors. And every 4th of July, when the fireworks begin echoing across the trees, I'm reminded of those footsteps circling our tents. In my mind, I can still hear someone walking slowly around them, stopping every once in a while to just stare. Hope you get this in time for the 4th of July. Happy 4th, everybody. Terrifying 4th of July Party, submitted by Jimmy Jam. My name is Jim, and this happened in Decatur, Illinois during the 1998. I've never told the whole story publicly because even after all these years, I still wake up some nights thinking I hear footsteps walking around my house. I was 24 years old and renting a rundown 2-story house with my friends Eric and Matt just a few blocks from Millikan University. The place wasn't much to look at, but it had a huge backyard and a detached garage where we'd keep coolers full of beer whenever we had people over. That July, and this is long after everyone had survived their finals and work schedules were finally lining up, we decided to throw a big 4th of July party. Dozens of people came over for the afternoon, and as evening wore on, people started moving into the house. I recognized most of the 40 or 50 people there, but like every party at that age, there were plenty of faces that I'd never seen before. Music was blasting from the stereo, and people were spilling out onto the porch, and groups of people were wandering through every room with plastic cups in their hands. There was one guy, though, that stuck out to me, a guy that I'd never met. He didn't seem to be drinking, and he wasn't really hanging out with anybody. He just stood near the hallway wearing this faded green work jacket. Every few minutes he'd drift off somewhere else without saying a word, and I assumed he was just somebody's older brother. About an hour after I first noticed him, I noticed him again. This time, he was coming down the stairs from our bedrooms. "Hey, man," I said to him, and he looked directly at me. He just said, "I was looking for the bathroom." And I pointed downstairs and said, "Dude, it's the first door by the kitchen. Nobody goes upstairs." He just nodded at me, and I should have thrown him out right then. But around 11, my friend Kelly couldn't find her purse. Everyone figured someone had moved it. I mean, there were a lot of people there. And then my friend Brian realized his wallet was gone. Then somebody's car keys disappeared. We tried to laugh it off at first. I mean, drunk people lose things, right? But then Eric walked into the kitchen holding one of our steak knives and said, "Why was this on the basement steps?" I certainly didn't have an answer. I mean, it should have been in our knife block. Eric shrugged and stuck it back where it belonged, and about 20 minutes later I went upstairs to grab another case of beer that I'd had stashed away in my bedroom closet. We were running out. My bedroom door was shut, and I distinctly remembered leaving it open. When I went inside, nothing looked like it had been gone through. Everything was untouched. And that's when I noticed my dresser drawers. Every single one of them had been opened. I went through them really quick, and nothing valuable was missing, but it was like someone had just been searching through everything. Then I heard a floorboard creak in the attic above me. Our attic didn't have any finished floor. It was just exposed beams. I mean, we never even went up there. So I yelled out, "Matt?" I didn't get an answer. I climbed halfway up the pull-down ladder and didn't see anything but darkness. But then something shifted farther back in the attic. It wasn't walking. It was like crawling. And every instinct in me I had screamed at me to just get down. I slammed the attic door shut and then went downstairs, but by then nobody wanted to listen to me. They figured maybe a couple had gone up there looking for a place to make out, and I said, "Holy shit, it's got to be 110 degrees up there." But in my drunkenness, I let it go. Around midnight, the lights suddenly went out, and the music stopped. Everybody kind of groaned, and Eric grabbed a flashlight in the kitchen while I checked the breaker panel in the basement. The breaker hadn't been tripped, and as I turned to head back upstairs, the flashlight beam caught something that made my stomach drop. The electrical meter had been smashed from the outside, Somebody had deliberately cut power to the house. Before I could process it, I heard someone screaming upstairs. I mean, really screaming. They weren't playful. This was someone terrified. So I sprinted up the stairs, and Kelly stumbled into the hallway, clutching her arm. Blood was streaming through her fingers. "I thought it was Julie. I thought it was Julie," she kept saying over and over. And finally she blurted out, "Somebody grabbed me from behind in the bathroom." The cut on her forearm wasn't deep, but it was long enough to convince everyone that this was not a prank. And that's when everyone started searching every room. And that's when I noticed that that stranger I'd seen was nowhere to be found. Someone yelled that the back door was open, and some people ran out into the yard, but they didn't see anything. I figured if it was that guy, maybe he was just gone. But we did call the police. Thank God we were all over age. Dispatch told us officers were tied up on another emergency, and they would take a while. Most people started to leave, and then Brian noticed something horrifying. He couldn't find his girlfriend, Amanda. He saw her purse on the couch, and when he looked outside, her car was still parked in our driveway. We searched all around the yard and the garage and didn't find anything, and then finally Eric said, "Maybe we ought to check upstairs again." The four of us grabbed baseball bats and climbed the stairs together, and halfway up we heard this muffled banging. The sound came from Matt's bedroom. And we tried to open it, but the door wouldn't open. Something was blocking it. Eric rammed it with his shoulder. A dresser had been put in front of it, and from what we could see, it was Amanda. She was lying on the bed, tied at the wrist with an extension cord behind the bedroom door, and a strip of duct tape was over her mouth. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe, and she pointed frantically with her feet toward the closet. That's when the closet door slowly swung open, but nobody came out. We got the dresser away from the door, and Eric stepped towards the closet. That's when something exploded from the darkness. Not something, someone. The man in the green jacket. He came flying through the hanging clothes and was holding a hammer. He swung it straight at Eric's head, and Eric barely got his bat up in time to knock the hammer away. And the craziest thing was, the stranger didn't yell, he didn't say anything to us, he just attacked. He shoved Eric backwards and then lunged toward me. I'm not ashamed to admit I'd never been in a real fight before. I just started swinging wildly. My bat connected with his shoulder hard enough to spin him sideways, and Matt tackled him. The guy drove his thumb into Matt's eye and nearly gouged it out before Brian kicked him across the ribs, but the guy kept fighting. He was strong as hell. The look in his eyes, though, is what I remember the most. There was no anger or panic. There was no fear. There was just complete emptiness. I mean, the deadest eyes I had ever seen. He reached into his jacket, and for one horrible second I thought, oh shit, he's got a gun. But instead, he pulled out another kitchen knife, the same kind Eric had found earlier, right from our knife block. He slashed Brian across the stomach, cutting through his shirt before Eric recovered and cracked the bat across his back. The sound was so loud and kind of gross, and the guy just fell over onto one knee. Matt picked up a broken closet rod and jammed it across the guy's throat, and I hit him again and again, this time across the forearms. The knife fell out of his hand, but he still refused to quit. I mean, he was clawing at the air, he was biting, he was kicking, and he was scrambling after the knife, but Brian stopped that. He was bleeding but pissed off, and he tackled him from behind. The four of us just piled on top of him, and Eric landed punch after punch while Matt just had his arms pinned. Honestly, I thought we were going to kill him. I mean, maybe if we hadn't, he might have killed us. I don't know. Someone downstairs finally shouted that police had arrived, and officers rushed into the room and dragged us off the guy. But even handcuffed, the guy kept trying to crawl towards Amanda, who we'd totally forgotten was still tied down to the bed. One officer actually had to knee him in the shoulder to stop him. When they searched his jacket, they found wallets, jewelry, Kelly's missing keys, a roll of black electrical tape, and some extra knives wrapped in towels. And the creepiest thing? A small notebook. Inside the notebook were descriptions of people at the party. Hair colors, clothing, who'd gone upstairs, who went outside, who was alone most of the night, how many people had been drinking heavily. This guy had spent hours watching everyone before deciding who to attack. Detectives later told us that he wasn't connected to anyone at the party. He had simply been wandering through neighborhoods looking for a large gathering where strangers could blend in unnoticed. They suspected that he'd done it before, and whether that's true, I don't know. I only know what happened inside our house. Kelly still has a scar on her arm. Brian needed 28 stitches. Matt's vision in his one eye never completely recovered, and Amanda refused to sleep alone for years after that night. For me, I got out okay. A little mental damage, I'm sure. And every time I hear someone say, "the more the merrier," I think about that silent guy standing in my hallway watching all of us laugh and have fun while he was planning who to attack first. We're so conditioned to think that crazy people always announce themselves by their smile, by their waves, by anything that they say. But this time, this guy just quietly walked into our crowded house in Decatur, Illinois, where no one questioned whether he belonged there until it was way too late. Break-in when I was 10. Submitted by Carl. I was 10 years old when this happened, and now, more than 30 years later, I still can't watch 4th of July fireworks without remembering this night. Each year, I'm taken back to my little ranch house at the end of a quiet suburban street, and sitting alone in the dark while something far more terrifying than fireworks was waiting just outside the front door. Back in the 80s, leaving kids home alone wasn't considered unusual. Nobody thought much of it at all. Parents didn't carry cell phones, and neighbors weren't constantly checking in. And if you were old enough to know how to lock the door and dial the phone, you were usually considered responsible enough to stay by yourself for a couple of hours. At least that's the way my parents were, and all my friends' parents, too. That 4th of July, I'd come down with a nasty stomach bug, and I spent most of the afternoon on the couch, feeling miserable while my parents and my older sister were having a blast and packing folding chairs into the station wagon. We'd planned for weeks to watch the fireworks display across town, but that day, every time I stood up, my stomach just rolled. Mom wanted to stay home with me, but I insisted that she go, and I distinctly remember saying, "I'll probably just sleep anyway." So she kissed my forehead and left a bucket beside the couch just in case I had to puke, and reminded me to keep every door locked. Dad showed me how to use the deadbolt one more time, even though I'd done it 100 times by then. "We'll be back before 11, he said. And then I sat on the couch and watched their taillights disappear down the street. The house became impossibly quiet. Outside I could still hear neighbors laughing and kids riding bikes and throwing sparklers and other fireworks at each other. Inside, our ticking grandfather clock sounded louder than ever. I flipped through all of our basic TV cable channels until I found a Godzilla movie, and then I just pulled the blanket up around me and sat there watching. Around 9 o'clock, the neighborhood seemed empty. Everyone had gone to the park for the fireworks. The streetlights illuminated rows of parked cars, but there was almost no one outside anymore. And that's when someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Not really loud, not pounding, just 3 deliberate knocks. I froze. Nobody was supposed to come over. I peeked through the living room curtains, and there was a guy standing on the porch wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low over his face. He wasn't carrying anything, and he just stared at the door. After about 30 seconds, he knocked again, and that's when he tried the doorknob. Now my stomach was knotting for a completely different reason, but thank God the deadbolt held. The guy stood there for another few seconds before walking off the porch, and I remember letting out a breath that I'd been holding. Then I came to my senses and thought, the guy probably just had the wrong house. But then I heard footsteps running along the side of our house really fast, and then our side gate creak open. Whoever it was had gone into the backyard. I grabbed our cordless phone from its charger and quietly walked toward the kitchen. Every window over the sink looked into our fenced backyard, so I stayed below the windows and rose up just enough to peek outside. The man was no longer alone. Now he had a buddy with him. One of them was trying the back door, and the other was looking into every window he could look into. When he got to the kitchen windows, I ducked so fast I nearly dropped the phone. I was going to call 911, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. But I didn't get anything. I tried hanging up, tried dialing again, tried turning the phone off and on, but there was nothing. It wasn't until much later that my father told me that these guys had apparently cut the telephone line outside. At the time, as a 10-year-old, I just thought the phone had stopped working. But I didn't think too much of it at the time, because what I heard next scared the piss out of me. Glass breaking. Not shattering completely, just one careful punch, and then another one. Whoever was out there was breaking the small window to our back door. I did the only thing I could do. I ran. Every instinct told me to get as far away as possible, but being the idiot 10-year-old I was, I never once thought to run out the front door and maybe down the street to a neighbor's house. Where did I go? The place that everyone says not to go in a horror movie. Our tiny attic storage space above the hallway. It was just big enough to keep old Christmas decorations and stuff like that out there, and we had one of those pull-down ladders with the hatch on it. I dragged a chair into the closet as quietly as I could and climbed up and pulled the hatch open, and then crawled inside. There wasn't enough room to stand. It was just fiberglass insulation covering everything, and I'd pulled the hatch almost closed, but left a tiny crack so I could still see into the hallway. Seconds later, the back door opened, and I heard footsteps in the kitchen. One man's voice floated through the house saying, "I told you somebody's home." And then someone else had this really creepy shrill laugh and said, "Okay, go find him." Him. And they knew I was in the house. Every muscle in my body locked up. I pressed both hands over my mouth because I could hear myself breathing, and they searched every room methodically. They were opening cabinets and closet doors. I could hear them moving furniture around, and one of them turned the television off. And the silence that followed that was somehow even worse than the sounds of them moving around. Then the guy with the shrill voice called out, "Kid, we're not going to hurt you." Even at 10 years old, I knew that was bullshit. Then footsteps stopped directly beneath the attic hatch. I could actually see one of the guy's boots through the narrow opening, and he stood perfectly still, listening. Finally, he said, "Go check the bedrooms again," and the footsteps moved away. I nearly cried from relief. Then there was a loud boom from outside. The fireworks had started. So the explosions were masking every sound inside the house, and these guys took advantage of it. Drawers were now being slammed open. Furniture was being tossed. These guys even picked off picture frames off the wall and broke them for no reason. Our entire home was being destroyed while the entire neighborhood was off watching fireworks less than 2 miles away. Nobody heard any of this other than me. Eventually, one of them returned to the hallway carrying a flashlight. He swept the beam across the ceiling, and the light passed directly over the attic hatch. It went away, but it came back. I stopped breathing. The beam was centered on that tiny opening, and whoever was holding that flashlight had seen the hatch wasn't fully closed. Next thing I knew, the ladder was rattling and he was pulling it down. I did my best to be as quiet as I could, scrambling backward through the insulation until my back hit the far wall. But then there was nowhere else to go. There was no exit, there was no window, there was nothing up there to save me. The hatch swung open, and the flashlight beam flooded the attic. I just flattened myself against the beams as best I could, hidden behind several large storage boxes. The man climbed halfway up the ladder, and his head emerged into the attic, and I could hear him breathing. He just whispered, "Come on out. You can't stay hidden forever." Then the flashlight kind of went left and right, and stopped inches from where my hand was laying. I just closed my eyes and hoped for the best. Another firework exploded outside, and then another. And suddenly someone downstairs yelled, "Forget it!" The guy with the shrill voice. The other guy said, "What?" And the shrill voice responded, "Got the jewelry, let's go." The guy stayed there on the ladder for another second and then got down, and the attic hatch slammed shut. I didn't move. Not for 5 minutes, not for 10. I stayed exactly where I was until my legs cramped up so bad I couldn't feel them anymore. Finally, I heard car doors outside, and then silence. Much later, I heard another car, and several voices, my mom screaming my name. I crawled back over to the attic hatch, popped it open, and was crying so hard I nearly fell off the ladder. The living room looked like a tornado had hit it. Every drawer had been dumped onto the floor. And again, as I mentioned, pictures smashed, furniture everywhere, and our back door hung on one crooked hinge. My dad called the police, and they told my parents the burglars had probably been following neighborhoods during fireworks because so many houses were empty. They hadn't expected to find a child inside one of them. And once they realized someone was home, they began searching for me instead of immediately leaving. Whether they intended to silence a witness or simply make sure no one called the police, that's anybody's guess. The guys were never caught. Years afterwards, though, detectives connected similar break-ins to a group targeting holiday evenings, but there was never enough evidence to charge anyone for what happened at our place. My parents didn't leave me home alone again for 4 years. I guess it's obvious to say that when people think of the 4th of July, they think about cookouts, families, celebrations, and fireworks. Me? I think about slow knocks on the front door, a flashlight sweeping across a dark attic, and a terrifying realization that sometimes the loudest night of the year is the perfect time for someone to break into your home, because nobody can hear you trying to survive. Scariest night of my life. I hope nobody listening to this ever has to go through with something like that. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.